Bonnie, take it away.
Hey everybody, it's so good that so many people showed up, and it's great to be able to talk to you about something I'm really passionate about. My talk's entitled Sparking Altruism for Energy Behavior Change. And it's really a blend of a few interests of mine, and I think if I give you a bit of a taste of my background, it might make more sense as to why I chose to weave these themes together. My undergraduate was in psychology, so I've always had an interest in human behavior. But after college, I moved to San Francisco and got really interested in business and ultimately entrepreneurship. I went and got my MBA at Babson and ended up founding a tech company and then founding a couple more tech startups. So really an interest too in using business to make positive change in the world. And so a few of those themes I think you'll find emerge through this talk, hopefully, but I'm really excited to hear your comments and feedback and questions. This is the work of a paper that was recently published in 2020 in Energy, Research, and Social Science. So the problem here that my work is looking to address is how energy supply and demand are really changing right now, fundamentally. 70% of energy generation infrastructure installed in 2017 is from renewable resources. And as many of you know, renewable resources are fundamentally different than the way we used to get power. Fossil fuels are predictable. Weather does not influence their ability to generate. Controllers have a lot more active control. And in a renewable energy generation infrastructure, there's a lot less control. It's also far more decentralized, which makes it more complicated too. The demand side, however, is also changing, which is why I think the current energy system in the United States and globally is in a really tough bind, because both supply and demand are totally metamorphing. So before, recently, we didn't need to charge our cars. We had a very different set of needs, but we also, in addition to the changing needs, we also have new abilities. In the top center, you'll see a funny little blue box, and that's an example of a local startup, Packetized Energy, that has a technology to basically turn water heaters into batteries that utilities can control. We've also included a Nest thermostat and solar panels, just to kind of illustrate how big of a change and a transition our energy system is currently undergoing. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but Frank Heels developed this really powerful theory on socio-technical transitions that's really been at the foundational for me in my research. And the basic idea is that new ideas emerge from niches, right? These small ideas are sheltered. They eventually bubble up and disrupt the socio-technical regime. The current infrastructure and government and policies and procedures. And meanwhile, there's sort of these higher level landscape developments, like an increased frequency in extreme weather events and more attention to climate issues that are occurring as well. So then sort of also putting pressure on that middle layer of the socio-technical regime. And one of the most common themes in this literature is this tension between a centralized system and a decentralized system. What we've had is sort of a hub and spoke model, right? Where all of the generation is happening in one place and we're sending it out. But with solar panels and this much more complicated infrastructure emerging, we're evolving into a more decentralized technological infrastructure. But a point that I think is really important to consider is that when I talk about the energy system transition, I'm not just talking about swapping out fossil fuel generators for renewables. The social piece is really important too, deconstructing these embedded power structures that do not invite diverse stakeholders to the table. It's just a very small set of individuals making really impactful decisions. And so to me, a big part of this socio-energy system transition is the social decentralization and the social changes that need to occur. And a key success factor for both the technology side and the social side is citizen engagement. Today, citizen engagement in the energy system is really comes in two flavors. There's energy efficiency, which is buy a better light bulb, weatherize your house, right? It's things we've all heard about. And that's sort of a more long-term request. If you buy a better refrigerator, you're going to see that's a decision you might make in a year or two when you need a new refrigerator. Whereas demand response is much more short-term and active. That's saying we have an energy peak coming up from 4 to 7 p.m. this afternoon. Don't use your dishwasher, right? So they're very different, but one thing that they have in common is that they both rely on this assumption that people are only motivated by money, that the only way to get folks to make efficiency choices and to respond to demand response signaling is to ask them to offer them money. And this research really asks the question and tries to provide quantitative evidence to repudiate the idea that we're not only motivated by money. So I'm really questioning that core assumption. And in order to do that, I really had to dig into a bunch of different theories because there has been quite a bit of research done. I'm not the first one to wonder if perhaps human motivation is a bit more nuanced than a dollar bill. And so it was really interesting. I ended up really digging most deeply into these three different fields of academia. Evolutionary economics is a really complex, beautiful theory, and it's really more about complex individualistic goals, right? That that everybody's different and everybody has a very unique constellation of goals that's based on nature and nurture, and that's why I created this sort of quadrant system in here to show what makes evolutionary economics different than some of the other research areas that I looked at. Whereas behavioral economics and renewed Darwinian theory are more guided by the idea that we have simple universal goals, right? And they're not unique to individuals. They're all, I mean, somebody may have put more emphasis or priority on one goal versus the others, but it's more simple. And then the other axis here is individual drive versus social drive, right? And both renewed Darwinian theory and evolutionary economics share this belief that humans really prioritize the needs of the group because they have a belief in wanting to be part of something bigger than themselves, and that's really a strong driver. Whereas behavioral economics is more concerned with individual priorities. So the reason that you're doing something is ultimately because it does improve your fitness level or whatever term you want to use. I'm going to dig a little bit into one of my favorite theories. It's called renewed Darwinian theory, and it's actually a theory that my great uncle, who was a professor at Harvard and did interdisciplinary work there, developed with the dean of the Harvard Business School. And so it's got this business background, but I just felt like it added nuance, but not in such a complex way, in a way that still, I think, allows for some new creative ideas to emerge. So in renewed Darwinian theory, there are 4 key drives. The first, everyone will be very familiar with, particularly electric utilities, the drive to acquire, that if people are offered the chance to have more of an asset, to have more money, then they will be motivated to behave in a certain way. But RD theory goes beyond that and suggests that there's also a drive to bond, to add value to a group, to be part of something greater than oneself, to have connections and intimacy. And the drive to bond is really what I focus on in my research. But the other drives I think are worth mentioning as well, because I think they hold a lot of promise for future research. The drive to comprehend is actually my favorite. It might be yours too as academics. It's the drive concerned with wonder and curiosity. This is why art is important to society. This is why we enjoy listening to poetry and music. And why we enjoy surprise and novelty, something that's missing in our lives during this pandemic very often. So also the reason why when people get an in-home device and have a little tablet and they can see how much energy they're using, they have a great time with it for a few months. And then the novelty wears off and it's less utilized. So that's an interesting launching pad. And then there's the drive to defend, which is interesting because that's the only drive that's completely reactive, and it's around loss aversion, and it only really is activated when somebody feels threatened. And that's when somebody, when like a family member is threatened, right, is taken away, when an identity or when a core set of beliefs is threatened, right? So I think it's an interesting one to consider. I won't go into too much detail as much as I'd like to, but happy to answer questions on this drive as well, whereas this theory. But to go more into the specifics of my research, I wanted to look at this drive to bond and see if it was actually powerful enough to affect change, if it could do as good or better of a job at motivating people to take a short-term action, to do a demand response event, if it could do that more effectively than the drive to acquire. So I teamed up with the Burlington Electric Department and a game design company called Game Theory in Burlington, Vermont. And I studied the program that they designed that was based on the drive to bond. So whenever there was a peak event in the summer of 2017, every resident in Burlington would get via Facebook, only free channels, Facebook, Twitter, we have a front porch forum if people are familiar with that, notifications that a peak event was forthcoming. So here, Monday, July 2nd, from 4 to 7 p.m., there's going to be, everyone needs to actively stop using as much energy. But instead of the traditional incentive of maybe $4 or $5, more likely 40 or 50 cents, that's used in this type of program, the incentive was a $1,000 one-time donation to a local charity. So what I wanted to see was whether or not this actually worked, even though the individuals, the Burlington customers who were asked to turn down to not use power for that one section of time, they weren't going to receive a single penny, and they weren't going to be publicly acknowledged for this either. It was all anonymous. I wanted to see if their behavior actually changed based on this altruistic motivational tool. And this is, sorry, I'm just trying to be able to see the data behind all of your lovely faces. Okay. So this is kind of one of the key slides of my research, and this is the quantitative approach that I took. I used a difference in differences model to compare a control day to an event day. In this situation, the control day is the orange line, and I found the average energy consumption from 1 to 4 p.m. and I compared it to the average energy consumption from 4 to 7 p.m. during the event to see if people behaved differently when they were given a signal that it was potentially a peak event. So I chose a day that was similar precipitation, similar humidity, similar weather, within close proximity, and similar day of the week. It turns out that that actually does matter quite a bit. And I was able to prove quantitatively that there was a difference, that the slope of the line was actually quite different on the control day versus the treatment day. And with Burlington Electric Department's help, I was able to show that they actually saved quite a bit of money by doing this. And just to provide a little bit of context, demand response fatigue is a topic that papers have been written about. It is notoriously difficult to get folks to respond to demand response signals. Typically, you have to pay them a lot of money, and even then, it really doesn't work that well. In large part, that's because the households that are using the most energy are the ones who are least impacted by the $4 or $5 that a utility could possibly scrounge up. But this type of result is incredibly unusual in the demand response world, and it translated to $191,000 in savings. And the only hard costs, and of course there was soft costs like marketing dollars that they paid somebody to work on the programming. But ultimately, the hard costs were about $6,000, and those were in donations to local charities. So it was a really cool way to connect the electric department to the communities and to help them show support to nonprofits in the area, but also to realize a huge amount of savings that they could ultimately pass along to their customers as well. My conclusion which is a bit risque, is that people are good. That pro-social appeals like this one can strengthen energy behavior programming. The reason why why it was so important to me to get a number, to have a 11-to-1 data point, for example, was because of my background in business. I knew that when electric utilities are making decisions about where they're going to invest their money, it's very difficult for them to get approval from their board of directors, particularly if it's perceived as soft or fluffy or risky, right? It's not a very risk tolerant industry. But by being able to show quantitatively that this did make an impact and it was a huge savings, far better than most demand response programs would ever hope to achieve. By doing that, I am hoping that that these results are going to make it possible for more utilities to engage in the same type of program and to help local utilities and to invite more stakeholders to be part of these decisions. Because to me, this is part of a larger goal, right? It's that social decentralization. It's bringing more people to the table. It's inviting them to participate in a way that's respectful and acknowledges that they have more nuanced feelings and goals and priorities. And it's allowing them to, in my mind also, to have part of their identity be somebody who helps, somebody who is involved and who's doing so for the right reasons, not because they're just offered money. And as ecological economists, I know many of you are familiar with the negative side effects of offering someone money, that often it can deteriorate other goals. And here are some references. I would welcome any questions, and I so appreciate your giving me the time to speak.
Great, thank you, Bonnie. I'll clap for everybody.